Question 1. Implementation of a new live streaming strategy for an Alabama-based esports organization involves incorporating various elements, including in-game footage, licensed music for background ambience, and fan-submitted highlight clips. What is the most legally sound and ethically responsible approach to managing potential copyright issues in this context? Option A. Rely on the argument that the content is being used for promotional purposes for the game developers or artists, thereby negating the need for explicit licensing. Option B. Proactively identify all copyrighted materials intended for use and secure the necessary licenses or permissions from the respective copyright holders before incorporating them into live streams. Option C. Only address copyright concerns if a specific takedown notice is received from a copyright holder regarding the organization's live stream content. Option D. Proceed with the live streaming strategy, assuming that the use of copyrighted material in a live, non-archived format constitutes fair use under Alabama law. Correct answer is B. Proactively identify all copyrighted materials intended for use and secure the necessary licenses or permissions from the respective copyright holders before incorporating them into live streams. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in the rapidly evolving esports landscape, particularly concerning live streaming. The professional challenge lies in balancing the desire to engage a broad audience with the legal obligations surrounding intellectual property rights. Esports organizations and streamers often operate with limited legal resources, leading to potential oversights in copyright compliance. The rapid pace of content creation and dissemination in live streaming makes proactive copyright management crucial, requiring careful judgment to avoid infringement and potential legal repercussions. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves proactively seeking and obtaining appropriate licenses or permissions from copyright holders for any copyrighted material used in live streams. This approach directly addresses the core of copyright law, which grants exclusive rights to creators. By securing licenses, streamers and organizations ensure they have the legal authority to broadcast or incorporate protected works, thereby avoiding infringement. This aligns with Alabama law's recognition of copyright protections and the ethical responsibility to respect intellectual property rights. This proactive stance minimizes legal risk and fosters a sustainable content creation environment. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that the nature of live streaming, or the fact that it is a new medium, exempts content from copyright law. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of copyright principles, which apply broadly to creative works regardless of the medium of distribution. Relying on this assumption exposes the streamer to significant legal liability for infringement. Another incorrect approach is to only consider copyright when a direct takedown notice is received. This reactive strategy is insufficient and professionally irresponsible. Copyright infringement occurs at the moment of unauthorized use, not when a notice is issued. Waiting for a takedown notice means infringement has already happened, leading to potential legal action, damages, and reputational harm. It demonstrates a lack of due diligence and respect for creators' rights. A further incorrect approach is to argue that the use of copyrighted material is fair use, without a proper legal analysis. While fair use is a defense to copyright infringement, it is a complex legal doctrine with specific factors that must be met. Making a unilateral determination of fair use without understanding these factors or consulting legal counsel is risky and often leads to misapplication, resulting in infringement. Professional reasoning. Professionals in the Alabama esports industry should adopt a proactive and informed approach to copyright management. This involves 1. Understanding the scope of copyright law as it applies to creative works, including game assets, music, and broadcast footage. 2. Implementing clear internal policies and training for streamers and content creators regarding copyright compliance. 3. Establishing a process for identifying and obtaining necessary licenses or permissions for all third-party copyrighted material intended for use in live streams. 4. Consulting with legal counsel specializing in intellectual property and media law when in doubt about copyright status or licensing requirements. 5. Regularly reviewing and updating copyright compliance procedures in light of evolving legal interpretations and industry best practices. Question 2. To address the challenge of a professional esports player in Alabama not receiving agreed-upon compensation and benefits as stipulated in their contract, What is the most prudent and legally sound course of action for the player to pursue? Option A. Immediately post accusations of contract breach on social media and cease all communication with the esports organization. Option B. Thoroughly review the player contract, gather all relevant documentation, and seek legal counsel from an Alabama licensed attorney specializing in contract law to advise on available remedies and procedural steps. Option C. Accept the non-payment as a business risk and move on without pursuing any formal recourse. Option D. Attempt to resolve the dispute through informal conversations with the organization's management without any documentation or legal advice. The correct answer is B. Thoroughly review the player contract, gather all relevant documentation, and seek legal counsel from an Alabama licensed attorney specializing in contract law to advise on available remedies and procedural steps. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it involves a potential breach of contract within the context of Alabama's burgeoning esports industry. Core difficulty lies in determining the appropriate legal recourse and remedies when a professional esports team fails to uphold its contractual obligations regarding player compensation and benefits. Professionals must navigate the intersection of contract law and the specific nuances of esports agreements, requiring careful consideration of the Alabama Code and relevant case law to ensure fair and legally sound resolutions. The potential for financial loss, reputational damage, and the impact on player morale necessitates a judicious and informed approach. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves a thorough review of the existing contract between the player and the esports organization, specifically examining clauses related to payment schedules, bonus structures, and any stipulated benefits. This approach necessitates gathering all relevant documentation, including payment records, communication logs, and any amendments to the original agreement. Subsequently, seeking legal counsel specializing in contract law, and if possible, sports or esports law in Alabama is crucial. This legal expert can advise on the strength of the player's claim under Alabama contract law, the available remedies such as seeking unpaid wages, damages for breach or specific performance, and the most effective procedural steps to pursue these remedies, whether through negotiation, mediation, arbitration, or litigation in an Alabama court. This aligns with the principle of upholding contractual integrity and seeking redress through established legal channels as permitted by Alabama statutes. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to immediately cease all communication with the esports organization and publicly accuse them of breach of contract on social media platforms. This action could be detrimental as it may prejudice any future legal proceedings, potentially limit the available remedies under Alabama law, and could even expose the player to defamation claims. Furthermore, it bypasses the necessary steps of contract review and legal consultation, which are fundamental to a successful claim. Another unacceptable approach is to accept the situation without seeking any form of recourse, assuming that the contract is unenforceable or that the player has no legal standing. This overlooks the fundamental principles of contract law in Alabama, which generally provide remedies for breaches of valid agreements. By failing to investigate and pursue legitimate claims, the player forfeits their right to compensation and potentially allows the organization to continue engaging in similar practices. A further flawed approach is to attempt to resolve the dispute solely through informal discussions with the organization's management without any documentation or legal guidance, especially if these discussions are unproductive or lead to further unfulfilled promises. While informal resolution can be beneficial, it is insufficient when significant contractual obligations, such as payment of wages, are not being met. This approach lacks the structure and legal backing necessary to compel compliance or secure appropriate remedies under Alabama law. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such a situation should adopt a systematic decision-making process. First, meticulously review the contract and gather all supporting evidence. Second, consult with legal counsel to understand their rights and obligations under Alabama law and to strategize the best course of action. Third, engage in formal communication with the organization, potentially through legal representatives, to attempt a negotiated settlement. If negotiation fails, consider alternative dispute resolution methods like mediation or arbitration, as stipulated in the contract or agreed upon by both parties. Litigation should be considered a last resort, pursued only after exhausting other avenues and with a clear understanding of the legal process in Alabama. This structured approach ensures that actions are legally sound, strategically advantageous, and aimed at achieving a just and enforceable resolution. Question 3. The review process indicates that an emerging sports organization in Alabama is in urgent need of signing a talented new player. The organization faces financial constraints and is eager to finalize a contract quickly to secure the player's participation in upcoming tournaments. What is the most prudent and legally compliant approach to drafting and negotiating this player contract under Alabama law? Option A. Adopt a generic sports player contract template found online and make minor modifications based on the organization's understanding of the situation. Option B. Have the organization's manager, who has no legal training, negotiate and draft the contract based on verbal agreements and informal understandings with the player. Option C. Engage independent legal counsel with expertise in Alabama sports and entertainment law to draft and review the player contract, ensuring full compliance with all state regulations and industry best practices. Option D. Utilize the organization's general counsel, who has broad corporate law experience but no specific expertise in sports or Alabama player contract regulations, to draft the agreement. The correct answer is C. Engage independent legal counsel with expertise in Alabama sports and entertainment law to draft and review the player contract, ensuring full compliance with all state regulations and industry best practices. Explanation. The review process indicates a common challenge in a sports contract negotiation, balancing the immediate needs of a burgeoning sports organization with the long-term legal and ethical obligations to its players. This scenario is professionally challenging because the organization's financial instability creates pressure to secure favorable terms quickly, potentially at the expense of player welfare and compliance with Alabama's specific regulations governing player contracts and compensation. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any agreement is not only commercially viable, but also legally sound and ethically responsible. The best professional approach involves prioritizing a comprehensive review of the player's contract by independent legal counsel specializing in sports and entertainment law, with a specific focus on Alabama's statutory requirements for player agreements. This ensures that the contract adequately addresses all mandatory provisions, including compensation, termination clauses, intellectual property rights, and dispute resolution mechanisms, all while adhering to Alabama's legal framework for professional player contracts. This proactive legal review mitigates risks of future disputes, regulatory noncompliance, and potential exploitation of the player, thereby safeguarding both the player's rights and the organization's long-term stability. An approach that involves the organization's general counsel, who lacks specific expertise in sports or Alabama player contract law, to draft the agreement is professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a lack of specialized knowledge, increasing the likelihood of overlooking critical Alabama-specific legal nuances or industry best practices, leading to a contract that may be unenforceable or expose the organization to significant legal liabilities. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to rely solely on a template contract found online without any customization or legal review. This is a significant ethical and regulatory failure because online templates are rarely tailored to the specific circumstances of the parties or the unique legal landscape of Alabama sports. Such an approach risks noncompliance with Alabama statutes and could result in clauses that are unfair, unenforceable, or detrimental to either party. Finally, an approach that involves the organization's manager, who has no legal background, to negotiate and draft the contract based on informal understandings is highly problematic. This method disregards the fundamental legal requirements for contract formation and enforcement, particularly in a regulated industry like professional sports. It creates a high probability of creating an agreement that is legally deficient, unenforceable, and ethically questionable, potentially leading to disputes and significant financial and reputational damage for the organization. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the core legal and ethical obligations under Alabama law. This involves understanding the specific regulatory requirements for player contracts in the state. Subsequently, professionals should seek expert legal counsel to ensure all agreements are drafted and reviewed in strict compliance with these regulations and industry standards. Risk assessment should be a continuous process, evaluating potential legal, financial, and reputational consequences of proposed contract terms. Prioritizing transparency and fairness in negotiations, even under pressure, is crucial for building sustainable relationships and ensuring long-term success. Question 4. Examination of the data shows that an emerging esports organization in Alabama is eager to sign a talented but relatively unknown player. The organization's primary goal is to secure the player's participation in upcoming tournaments and content creation for their brand. What is the most prudent approach to drafting the player contract to ensure legal enforceability and foster a sustainable professional relationship under Alabama law? Option A. Offer a contract with minimal detail, focusing on broad commitments from the player and vague promises of future performance-based bonuses and revenue sharing to expedite the signing process. Option B. Rely on a handshake agreement for key terms such as salary, prize money splits, and termination conditions, with a brief written document outlining only the player's commitment to participate in tournaments. Option C. Create a contract heavily weighted in favor of the organization, including clauses that grant the organization broad ownership of all player-generated content and impose significant penalties for early termination by the player, with minimal reciprocal obligations. Option D. Draft a comprehensive contract clearly defining the player's responsibilities, the organization's compensation and support obligations, intellectual property rights, term of the agreement, and dispute resolution mechanisms, ensuring all terms are fair and transparent. The correct answer is D. Draft a comprehensive contract clearly defining the player's responsibilities, the organization's compensation and support obligations, intellectual property rights, term of the agreement, and dispute resolution mechanisms, ensuring all terms are fair and transparent. Explanation. The scenario presents a common challenge in a sports contract negotiation, balancing the desire for rapid growth and player engagement with the need for robust legal protections and clear contractual terms. The professional challenge lies in ensuring that the contract, while attractive to a burgeoning sports organization in Alabama, adheres to the fundamental principles of contract law and specifically addresses the unique aspects of professional sports, such as intellectual property rights related to in-game assets and performance, and the potential for rapid shifts in player value and team dynamics. Careful judgment is required to avoid creating an agreement that is either unenforceable due to vagueness or exploitative of the player. The best professional approach involves meticulously defining the scope of services, compensation structure, intellectual property ownership, and dispute resolution mechanisms. This includes clearly outlining the player's obligations, e.g., participation in tournaments, content creation, team activities, the organization's obligations, e.g., salary, prize money distribution, equipment provision, training support, and the duration and termination clauses of the agreement. Crucially, it necessitates ensuring that all terms are fair, transparent, and compliant with Alabama contract law, particularly concerning employment classifications and compensation. This approach safeguards both parties by establishing clear expectations and legal recourse, fostering a sustainable and ethical professional relationship. An approach that prioritizes immediate player acquisition by offering vague promises of future benefits without concrete contractual terms is professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a lack of specificity, which can lead to disputes over what was promised versus what is legally binding. Alabama contract law requires a meeting of the minds on essential terms. Vague promises do not constitute such a meeting. Furthermore, neglecting to define intellectual property rights can lead to significant legal battles over ownership of content created by the player or team and the organization's brand. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to draft a contract that heavily favors the organization with overly restrictive clauses that may be deemed unconscionable or violate Alabama's public policy regarding fair labor practices. This could include clauses that unfairly seize all intellectual property rights without adequate compensation, impose unreasonable penalties for termination, or fail to provide adequate recourse for the player in case of organizational breach. Such terms undermine the ethical foundation of the agreement and risk legal challenge. Finally, an approach that relies on verbal assurances for critical aspects of the agreement, such as performance bonuses or termination conditions, is also professionally unsound. While verbal agreements can be binding in some contexts under Alabama law, the complexity and high stakes of professional sports contracts necessitate written documentation to ensure clarity, enforceability, and to prevent misunderstandings. The absence of written terms for key provisions creates significant legal ambiguity and risk. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the client's objectives and the regulatory landscape in Alabama. This involves identifying all essential contractual elements, drafting clear and unambiguous language, ensuring fairness and transparency in all provisions, and seeking legal counsel to review and finalize the agreement. The process should prioritize risk mitigation for both parties and foster a relationship built on mutual respect and legal compliance. Question 5. Upon reviewing the operational framework for an upcoming online esports tournament organized by an Alabama-based company, which involves participants from various states, including Alabama, what is the most prudent jurisdictional approach to ensure compliance with Alabama Esports Law? Option A. Rely solely on the terms of service of the esports platform being used to dictate jurisdictional compliance, without independent verification of legal jurisdiction. Option B. Assume that because the tournament is online and participants are geographically dispersed, no single state's jurisdiction applies, or that the jurisdiction of the participant's location automatically governs. Option C. Proactively identify and confirm the applicable jurisdiction by assessing the physical location of the organizing entity, the event's primary nexus, and the location of participants, and then ensuring adherence to Alabama's relevant legal framework where applicable. Option D. Ignore potential jurisdictional issues altogether, proceeding with the assumption that the lack of explicit Alabama esports legislation means no jurisdiction applies. Correct answer is C. Proactively identify and confirm the applicable jurisdiction by assessing the physical location of the organizing entity, the event's primary nexus, and the location of participants, and then ensuring adherence to Alabama's relevant legal framework where applicable. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the evolving nature of esports and the potential for jurisdictional ambiguity, particularly when dealing with participants and entities operating across state lines. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance with Alabama's specific regulatory framework for esports, which may not be as clearly defined as traditional sports. The best professional approach involves proactively identifying and confirming the applicable jurisdiction for any esports event or participant engagement. This means understanding where the participants are physically located, where the event is being hosted, and where the organizing entity is based, and then determining which state's laws, specifically Alabama's if any nexus exists, would govern. For instance, if an Alabama-based esports organization is hosting an online tournament where participants are located in various states, including Alabama, the organization must ascertain if Alabama law applies to those participants or the tournament itself. This proactive verification ensures that all activities align with the known or reasonably inferred legal requirements of Alabama, thereby mitigating risks of noncompliance. This aligns with the principle of operating within established legal boundaries and respecting the sovereignty of jurisdictions. An incorrect approach would be to assume that because the tournament is online and participants are geographically dispersed, no single state's jurisdiction applies, or that the jurisdiction of the participant's location automatically governs without considering the organizer's location or the event's primary nexus. This oversight fails to acknowledge that Alabama law could still apply if the organizing entity is based in Alabama, or if significant promotional activities or revenue generation occur within the state. Such an assumption risks violating Alabama's esports regulations, potentially leading to penalties, legal disputes, and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach is to solely rely on the terms of service of the esports platform being used, without independent verification of legal jurisdiction. While platform terms are important, they do not supersede state laws. Relying exclusively on platform rules could lead to a situation where the platform's jurisdiction is different from the legally mandated jurisdiction under Alabama law, creating a compliance gap. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to ignore potential jurisdictional issues altogether, proceeding with the assumption that the lack of explicit Alabama esports legislation means no jurisdiction applies. This is a dangerous assumption. Even in the absence of specific esports statutes, general business, consumer protection, or contract laws of Alabama could be invoked if there is sufficient connection to the state. This passive stance leaves the organization vulnerable to unforeseen legal challenges. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes due diligence regarding jurisdiction. This involves 1. Identifying all potential points of contact with Alabama, e.g., organizer's domicile, participant location, event hosting, marketing efforts. 2. Researching Alabama's existing laws and regulations that might apply to a sports activity, even if indirectly. 3. Consulting with legal counsel specializing in gaming and sports law in Alabama to clarify jurisdictional boundaries. And 4. Implementing operational procedures that demonstrably comply with the determined applicable jurisdiction. Question 6. When evaluating the termination clause of a professional sports player's contract in Alabama, what is the most prudent course of action for an sports organization seeking to end the agreement due to perceived underperformance? Option A. Immediately terminate the contract based on the organization's subjective assessment that the player's performance has declined significantly, regardless of whether specific performance metrics are detailed in the termination clause. Option B. Proceed with termination based on minor infractions or rule violations that are not explicitly listed as grounds for termination in the contract, assuming such actions implicitly justify ending the professional relationship. Option C. Review the termination clause to ascertain if it specifies objective performance metrics or material breaches as grounds for termination, and ensure the player has been provided with clear notice and an opportunity to address any performance deficiencies as outlined in the contract. Option D. Interpret the termination clause broadly to include any perceived negative impact the player might have on team morale or public perception, even if these are not explicitly defined as termination conditions. The correct answer is C. Review the termination clause to ascertain if it specifies objective performance metrics or material breaches as grounds for termination, and ensure the player has been provided with clear notice and an opportunity to address any performance deficiencies as outlined in the contract. Explanation. When evaluating termination clauses in a sports contract governed by Alabama law, professionals face the challenge of balancing contractual freedom with consumer protection and fair dealing principles, particularly when a player's livelihood is at stake. The specific nature of sports, with its rapid evolution and the potential for significant player investment in training and career development, necessitates a careful review of termination provisions to ensure they are not unconscionable or unfairly applied. The best approach involves a thorough review of the termination clause to determine if it aligns with Alabama's contract law principles, specifically focusing on whether the conditions for termination are clear, reasonable, and supported by a legitimate business interest of the sports organization. This includes assessing if the clause allows for termination only upon specific, objectively verifiable events, e.g., material breach of contract, failure to meet performance metrics clearly defined in the contract, and whether adequate notice and opportunity to cure are provided, where applicable. Alabama law generally upholds freedom of contract, but will intervene to prevent unconscionable terms or breaches of good faith and fair dealing. A clause that allows for arbitrary or capricious termination without cause, or for reasons that are vague and subjective, would likely be scrutinized. An approach that focuses solely on the sports organization's desire to terminate the contract without a clear, predefined, and justifiable reason fails to consider the player's reasonable expectations and potential reliance on the contract. This could be seen as a breach of the implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing, which is recognized under Alabama law. Such an approach prioritizes the organization's immediate interests over its contractual obligations and ethical responsibilities. Another unacceptable approach is to interpret the termination clause in a manner that is overly broad or ambiguous, allowing for termination based on subjective interpretations of player performance or conduct that are not clearly outlined in the agreement. Alabama courts are likely to interpret ambiguous contract terms against the party that drafted them, and an overly aggressive or self-serving interpretation can lead to disputes and legal challenges. This approach disregards the need for clarity and fairness in contractual relationships. Finally, an approach that ignores the potential impact of termination on the player's career and reputation, and proceeds with termination based on minor or easily rectifiable issues is professionally unsound. While contracts grant rights, they also impose duties. Professionals should consider the proportionality of the termination action to the alleged breach and whether less severe remedies could be pursued. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and ethical consideration for the individual involved. The professional decision-making process should involve a meticulous examination of the contract's termination provisions, considering their clarity, reasonableness, and compliance with Alabama contract law. This includes assessing whether the conditions for termination are objective and verifiable, whether notice and cure periods are provided, and whether the termination aligns with the implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing. When in doubt, seeking legal counsel specializing in contract law in Alabama is advisable to ensure compliance and mitigate risk. Question 7. The analysis reveals that an esports organization based in Birmingham, Alabama, is facing a dispute with a professional player regarding the interpretation of performance-based bonus clauses in their contract. The player claims they met the criteria for a significant bonus, while the organization argues the criteria were not fully satisfied. What is the most legally sound and ethically responsible approach for the organization to take in resolving this dispute under Alabama law? Option A. Conduct a thorough review of the player contract, cross-referencing all bonus criteria and payout terms with relevant sections of the Alabama Code pertaining to contract law and wage disputes, and consult with legal counsel specializing in Alabama sports and entertainment law to ensure compliance and fairness. Option B. Seek guidance from a sports industry, best practices, and contract templates used in other states, assuming these standards are generally applicable to the situation in Alabama. Option C. Prioritize a swift resolution by offering the player a partial bonus payment to avoid protracted legal proceedings, even if the full contractual criteria have not been definitively met according to Alabama law. Option D. Rely on the organization's internal interpretation of the bonus clauses, as these were agreed upon during contract negotiation, and offer a settlement based on what the organization deems a reasonable compromise, without extensive legal review. The correct answer is A. Conduct a thorough review of the player contract, cross-referencing all bonus criteria and payout terms with relevant sections of the Alabama Code pertaining to contract law and wage disputes, and consult with legal counsel specializing in Alabama sports and entertainment law to ensure compliance and fairness. Explanation. The analysis reveals that navigating contract disputes in Alabama's burgeoning esports scene requires a nuanced understanding of both general contract law principles and the specific regulatory landscape governing professional sports and entertainment in Alabama. The professional challenge lies in balancing the rapid evolution of esports with established legal frameworks, ensuring fair play, player welfare, and business integrity. A key consideration is the enforceability of clauses within player contracts, particularly those pertaining to intellectual property, performance bonuses, and termination. The best professional approach involves meticulously reviewing the player contract against the Alabama Code, specifically provisions related to employment agreements, consumer protection, and any emerging regulations specific to professional gaming or sports. This includes verifying that all bonus structures are clearly defined, measurable, and compliant with Alabama's laws on wage and hour disputes. Furthermore, ensuring that intellectual property rights are unambiguously assigned and that termination clauses adhere to statutory notice periods and just cause requirements is paramount. This approach prioritizes legal compliance and player protection, minimizing the risk of future litigation and upholding ethical standards within the Alabama esports industry. An approach that focuses solely on the team's internal policies without cross-referencing Alabama state law is professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a disregard for the supremacy of state statutes, which can override or invalidate contractual terms that are not in compliance. Such an approach risks creating unenforceable clauses and exposing the team to legal challenges based on violations of Alabama's labor or consumer protection laws. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to interpret the contract based on common practices in other states or jurisdictions, without verifying their applicability and enforceability under Alabama law. Alabama has its own distinct legal interpretations and statutory requirements. Relying on external precedents without Alabama-specific validation can lead to misinterpretations of contractual obligations and rights, potentially resulting in breaches of contract that are not recognized or permissible under Alabama statutes. Finally, an approach that prioritizes speed of resolution over legal accuracy by offering a settlement that is not fully informed by the player's contractual rights under Alabama law is also professionally unsound. While efficiency is desirable, it must not come at the expense of legal integrity. Failing to conduct a thorough legal review of the player's claims in the context of Alabama's contract and sports law can lead to settlements that are either insufficient to resolve the dispute legally or create future liabilities for the team. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with a comprehensive understanding of the specific contract in question, followed by a thorough examination of relevant Alabama statutes and case law. This legal foundation should then be applied to the facts of the dispute, considering both the team's and the player's rights and obligations. Ethical considerations, such as fairness and transparency, should guide negotiations and resolution, always within the bounds of Alabama law. Question 8. Comparative studies suggest that aggressive marketing campaigns can significantly boost engagement in the burgeoning esports market. An Alabama-based esports company is launching a new virtual reality gaming platform and plans to advertise its guaranteed performance enhancements and unlimited prize pool opportunities. The marketing team believes these claims are aspirational and will attract a broad audience. What is the most prudent approach to ensure compliance with Alabama's consumer protection laws regarding these advertising claims? Option A. Disclose the guaranteed performance enhancements and unlimited prize pool opportunities in the smallest font size possible within the terms and conditions section of the platform's website. Option B. Proceed with the marketing campaign as planned, assuming that aspirational claims are generally accepted in the competitive esports industry and that competitors use similar language. Option C. Engage legal counsel specializing in Alabama consumer protection law to review all marketing materials for factual accuracy, substantiation, and clarity, ensuring compliance with the Alabama Deceptive Trade Practices Act. Option D. Rely on the marketing team's judgment that the claims are not intended to be literally true and therefore do not constitute deception under Alabama law. The correct answer is C. Engage legal counsel specializing in Alabama consumer protection law to review all marketing materials for factual accuracy, substantiation, and clarity, ensuring compliance with the Alabama Deceptive Trade Practices Act. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the promotion of a new esports product with the stringent consumer protection mandates under Alabama law, specifically concerning deceptive advertising and unfair trade practices. The core difficulty lies in ensuring that marketing claims, while persuasive, do not mislead potential consumers about the product's capabilities or the terms of any associated promotions, thereby avoiding violations of the Alabama Deceptive Trade Practices Act, ADPA. Careful judgment is required to navigate the line between aggressive marketing and outright deception. The best professional approach involves a thorough review of all marketing materials by legal counsel specializing in Alabama consumer protection law. This proactive step ensures that all claims, including those related to performance enhancements, prize pools, and subscription terms, are factually accurate, substantiated, and clearly communicated to consumers. This aligns with the ADPA prohibition against misrepresentations and deceptive acts or practices in commerce. By seeking expert legal review, the company demonstrates a commitment to compliance and mitigates the risk of engaging in conduct that could be deemed unfair or misleading under Alabama statutes. An incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the marketing team's interpretation of what constitutes a reasonable claim, without independent legal verification. This fails to account for the specific definitions and interpretations of deceptive practices under Alabama law, which can be broader than common understanding. Such an approach risks making unsubstantiated claims about performance or prize guarantees, which could be challenged as misleading under the ADPA. Another professionally unacceptable approach would be to bury crucial details about subscription renewals or prize eligibility in fine print or obscurely worded terms and conditions. While technically disclosed, this practice can be considered deceptive if it is designed to obscure important information from the average consumer, thereby violating the spirit and letter of Alabama's consumer protection laws, which aim for clear and conspicuous disclosure. Finally, a flawed strategy would be to assume that because similar marketing tactics are used by competitors in other jurisdictions, they are permissible in Alabama. Each state has its own regulatory framework, and Alabama's ADPA has specific provisions and enforcement priorities that must be respected. Ignoring these localized requirements and relying on a copycat approach from other markets is a recipe for legal noncompliance. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes proactive legal compliance. This involves 1. Understanding the specific consumer protection laws of the relevant jurisdiction, Alabama in this case. 2. Conducting thorough due diligence on all marketing claims and promotional offers. 3. Seeking expert legal counsel to review all materials before public dissemination. 4. Ensuring transparency and clarity in all communications with consumers. 5. Regularly reviewing and updating marketing practices to remain compliant with evolving regulations. Question 9. The investigation demonstrates that an Alabama-based esports organization is proposing a new player contract that includes broad language regarding the team's rights to the player's image and likeness for sponsorship purposes. The player, a rising star, is eager to sign, but has expressed concerns about how this might affect their ability to secure personal endorsement deals. What is the most prudent course of action for the player's representative to ensure the player's rights are adequately protected under Alabama law? Option A. Advise the player to sign the contract as is, assuming that standard industry practices will protect their interests regarding future personal endorsements. Option B. Negotiate for specific limitations on the scope and duration of the team's rights to the player's image and likeness for sponsorships, and ensure clear provisions for revenue sharing from any team-secured sponsorships. Option C. Accept the broad sponsorship clauses to expedite the contract signing process, with the understanding that any issues can be addressed through future amendments if they arise. Option D. Focus solely on the player's base salary and performance bonuses, considering sponsorship clauses as secondary and less critical to the immediate contract negotiation. The correct answer is B. Negotiate for specific limitations on the scope and duration of the team's rights to the player's image and likeness for sponsorships, and ensure clear provisions for revenue sharing from any team-secured sponsorships. Explanation. The investigation demonstrates a scenario where a professional esports agent in Alabama is faced with a contract negotiation for a promising player. The challenge lies in balancing the player's immediate financial needs and career advancement with the long-term implications of contract clauses, particularly those related to sponsorships and intellectual property rights, all within the framework of Alabama law governing player contracts. Careful judgment is required to ensure the player's rights are protected while securing a viable professional future. The best approach involves a thorough review of the proposed contract, focusing on clauses that grant the team broad rights to the player's image, likeness, and performance for sponsorship purposes. This approach prioritizes ensuring that any sponsorship agreements entered into by the team are clearly defined, limited in scope, and do not unduly restrict the player's ability to secure independent endorsement deals or leverage their personal brand in the future. It also necessitates ensuring that the player receives a fair share of any revenue generated from these sponsorships, as stipulated by Alabama law regarding player compensation and benefit. This proactive stance protects the player from exploitation and aligns with ethical obligations to advocate for their best interests. An incorrect approach would be to accept contract clauses that grant the team unlimited rights to the player's image and likeness for all future sponsorships without specific limitations or revenue-sharing provisions. This fails to protect the player's personal brand and future earning potential, potentially violating principles of fair dealing and Alabama's emphasis on equitable compensation for services rendered. Another incorrect approach would be to overlook the specifics of sponsorship clauses, assuming they are standard and benign. This oversight could lead to the player being bound to unfavorable sponsorship terms, or having their image used in ways that conflict with their personal values or other professional commitments, thereby failing to uphold the duty of care owed to the player under Alabama law. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to prioritize securing the contract quickly over ensuring the player fully understands and consents to all sponsorship-related terms. This haste could result in the player agreeing to terms they do not comprehend, leading to future disputes and potential legal challenges, and demonstrating a lack of diligence in representing the player's best interests. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that begins with a comprehensive understanding of the player's goals and concerns. This should be followed by a meticulous review of all contract terms, with particular attention to sponsorship and intellectual property clauses, cross-referencing them against relevant Alabama statutes and case law. Seeking clarification from the team or legal counsel when ambiguities arise, and ensuring the player receives clear explanations and has the opportunity to ask questions before signing are crucial steps in safeguarding the player's rights and fostering a sustainable professional career. Question 10. Analysis of a dispute between an Alabama-based sports organization and a professional player regarding unpaid prize winnings. The player claims they are owed $7,500 based on their team's performance in a sanctioned tournament, as per their contract. The organization claims a contractual clause allows for a 20% deduction for administrative fees, but the player disputes the validity and calculation of this deduction. If the player's contract stipulated a base prize share of $7,500 and the organization's disputed administrative fee is calculated as 20% of the gross winnings, what is the minimum amount the player is contractually entitled to receive if the administrative fee is deemed valid and applied? Option A, $6,000. Option B, $7,500. Option C, $1,500. Option D, $5,000. The correct answer is A, $6,000. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent power imbalance between a professional sports organization and an individual player, especially when financial disputes arise. The need for a fair and transparent resolution mechanism is paramount to uphold player rights, maintain the integrity of the organization, and comply with Alabama's specific regulatory framework for sports. Mismanagement of such disputes can lead to legal repercussions, reputational damage, and a breakdown of trust within the sports ecosystem. Careful judgment is required to select the most appropriate and legally sound dispute resolution method. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves initiating a formal mediation process as outlined by the Alabama Esports Player Protection Act, (EPA). This approach requires the player to submit a written complaint detailing the alleged breach of contract and the financial damages sought. The organization must then respond within a stipulated time frame, and if an agreement cannot be reached through direct negotiation, a neutral, certified mediator, appointed by the Alabama State Sports Commission (ASEC), will facilitate discussions. The mediator's role is to guide both parties towards a mutually acceptable resolution, which may involve financial compensation, contract renegotiation, or other agreed-upon terms. This method is correct because it directly aligns with the EPA mandate for structured, facilitated dispute resolution, prioritizing a less adversarial and more efficient outcome. The EPA emphasizes mediation as a primary step before escalating to more formal legal proceedings, ensuring that players have a clear, regulated pathway to address grievances. The financial aspect is addressed through the mediator's guidance in quantifying damages and exploring realistic settlement figures, potentially involving calculations of lost prize money, salary arrears, or other quantifiable financial losses based on contract terms and league rules. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to immediately dismiss the player's claim and refuse any form of discussion, citing the organization's internal policies without referencing the EPA. This fails to acknowledge the player's statutory rights under Alabama law and bypasses the mandated dispute resolution mechanisms. Ethically, it demonstrates a disregard for player welfare and fair dealing. Legally, it exposes the organization to potential penalties for noncompliance with the EPA. Another incorrect approach is to offer a settlement amount that is significantly lower than the demonstrable financial losses, without providing a clear, data-driven justification for the reduction. For instance, if a player is owed $5,000 in prize money, and the organization offers $1,000 without a valid contractual or regulatory basis for withholding the remaining amount, this constitutes a failure to adhere to fair financial resolution principles. This approach ignores the player's right to full compensation as stipulated by their contract and the EPA, and it can be seen as an attempt to exploit the player's potentially limited understanding of their financial entitlements. The calculation of the player's actual financial loss, which would be a key component of mediation, is undermined by such an arbitrary offer. A third incorrect approach is to suggest that the player pursue legal action in civil court without first attempting to resolve the dispute through the EPA-prescribed mediation process. While civil litigation is an option, the EPA establishes mediation as a prerequisite for many disputes, aiming to reduce the burden on the court system and provide a more accessible resolution for players. Circumventing this mandated step is a regulatory failure and can lead to the case being dismissed or delayed, forcing the player into a more costly and time-consuming process than necessary. Professional reasoning. Professionals in sports organizations must adopt a proactive and compliant approach to dispute resolution. This involves thoroughly understanding the Alabama Esports Player Protection Act and its procedural requirements. When a player raises a financial dispute, the first step should always be to review the player's contract and the relevant provisions of the EPA. The organization should then engage in good faith discussions, aiming for an amicable resolution. If direct negotiation fails, initiating the formal mediation process through the ASEC is the next logical and legally required step. Professionals should be prepared to present clear financial data and justifications for any proposed settlements, ensuring that calculations of damages are transparent and defensible. This systematic approach not only ensures legal compliance, but also fosters a more ethical and sustainable relationship with players. Question 11. Consider a scenario where an Alabama-based esports organization is planning to launch a new tournament series with a significant prize pool funded by entry fees and sponsorships. The organization's management is unsure if the structure of these prize pools, particularly concerning the element of chance in determining winners beyond pure skill, could be construed as illegal gambling under Alabama law. What is the most prudent and legally compliant course of action for the organization to take? Option A. Engage specialized legal counsel in Alabama to thoroughly review the tournament structure, prize pool mechanics, and revenue streams against current Alabama gambling statutes and relevant case law to ensure full compliance. Option B. Adopt the prize pool and revenue sharing models used by successful esports organizations in other states, believing that similar practices are likely acceptable in Alabama. Option C. Rely on the informal advice of experienced esports industry professionals and business consultants to structure the tournament, as they have a general understanding of the industry's operational norms. Option D. Proceed with the tournament as planned, assuming that the skill-based nature of esports exempts it from Alabama's gambling regulations, and address any legal issues if they arise. The correct answer is A. Engage specialized legal counsel in Alabama to thoroughly review the tournament structure, prize pool mechanics, and revenue streams against current Alabama gambling statutes and relevant case law to ensure full compliance. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the evolving nature of esports and the complex intersection of existing Alabama gambling laws with new forms of digital entertainment. Specifically, determining whether certain esports prize pools or revenue-sharing models constitute illegal gambling under Alabama law requires careful interpretation of statutes designed for traditional forms of wagering. Professionals must navigate the ambiguity to ensure compliance and avoid legal repercussions for themselves or their organizations. The best approach involves seeking expert legal counsel specializing in Alabama gambling law and esports. This is correct because it directly addresses the legal uncertainty by engaging with qualified professionals who can provide definitive guidance based on the specific nuances of Alabama statutes and relevant case law. This proactive measure ensures that any business model or operational decision is compliant with state regulations, mitigating risk and fostering a legally sound environment for esports stakeholders in Alabama. An incorrect approach would be to assume that because esports is a new medium, it falls outside the scope of current gambling laws. This is a failure because Alabama's gambling statutes are generally broad and can be interpreted to encompass activities that involve consideration, chance, and a prize, regardless of the digital format. Relying on such an assumption risks violating the law without realizing it. Another incorrect approach would be to model the esports operation solely on the practices of other states or jurisdictions without verifying their applicability to Alabama. This is professionally unacceptable because Alabama has its own distinct legal framework for gambling. What may be permissible in one state could be illegal in Alabama, leading to significant legal penalties. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to proceed with operations based on informal opinions from individuals not qualified in Alabama gambling law, such as other esports professionals or general business advisors. This is a critical failure as it bypasses the necessary legal due diligence. Informal opinions lack the authority and accuracy required to ensure compliance with state statutes, and could expose the individuals and their organizations to severe legal consequences. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance. This involves identifying potential legal ambiguities, consulting with legal experts licensed in the relevant jurisdiction, Alabama, thoroughly researching applicable statutes and case law, and implementing operational strategies that align with expert advice and regulatory requirements. Continuous monitoring of legal developments in esports and gambling law is also crucial. Question 12. During the evaluation of a new professional esports league being established in Alabama, what is the most appropriate method for determining its legal classification and regulatory obligations under Alabama law? Option A. Classify the league based on the common understanding of esports as a digital entertainment activity, assuming it falls outside traditional sports or gaming regulations. Option B. Determine the league's classification based on its technological infrastructure and the perceived market novelty of its operations. Option C. Assume that because the league utilizes video games and online platforms, it is inherently exempt from all forms of state regulation in Alabama. Option D. Analyze the league's operational activities, revenue streams, and the nature of its competitions against the definitions provided in the Alabama Code and relevant state administrative regulations concerning sports, gaming, and business entities. The correct answer is D. Analyze the league's operational activities, revenue streams, and the nature of its competitions against the definitions provided in the Alabama Code and relevant state administrative regulations concerning sports, gaming, and business entities. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because the rapid evolution of esports and its integration into traditional sports frameworks in Alabama necessitates a clear understanding of how these activities are legally defined and classified. Misclassification can lead to significant regulatory, licensing, and taxation issues, impacting both the esports entities and the state's oversight. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance with Alabama's specific legal landscape for sports and gaming. The best approach involves a thorough review of the Alabama Code and any relevant administrative regulations pertaining to sports, gaming, and business entities. This approach correctly identifies that the classification of an esports entity hinges on its operational activities, revenue streams, and the nature of the competitions it organizes or participates in, as defined by Alabama law. Specifically, it requires determining if the entity falls under definitions related to professional sports, gaming, or other regulated activities within the state. This aligns with the principle of regulatory compliance, ensuring that the entity is categorized according to existing Alabama statutes, thereby enabling proper licensing, taxation, and adherence to any consumer protection or participant welfare laws applicable to its classification. An approach that solely relies on the common understanding of esports as a digital game without considering Alabama's specific legal definitions is incorrect. This fails to acknowledge that legal classification is distinct from common parlance and can lead to noncompliance if the activity, under Alabama law, is deemed to be a form of regulated gaming or professional sport requiring specific licenses or adherence to different statutes. Another incorrect approach is to assume that because esports involves video games, it is automatically exempt from any form of state regulation. This overlooks the possibility that Alabama law might have broad definitions of gaming or sports that could encompass sports activities, especially if they involve wagering or professional competition with prizes. Such an assumption risks operating outside the established legal framework, potentially incurring penalties. Finally, classifying an esports entity based solely on its technological infrastructure or the perceived novelty of its operation, without reference to Alabama's statutory definitions, is also flawed. Legal classification must be grounded in established legal principles and definitions, not on subjective interpretations of technological advancement or market perception. Professionals should adopt a systematic decision-making process. First, identify the core activities of the esports entity. Second, thoroughly research the Alabama Code and relevant administrative rules for definitions of sports, gaming, and business operations. Third, compare the entity's activities against these legal definitions to determine the most accurate classification. Fourth, consult with legal counsel specializing in Alabama gaming and sports law if ambiguity exists. This ensures that the classification is legally sound and facilitates proactive compliance. Question 13. Research into the establishment of an Alabama-based professional esports team seeking to recruit players and establish partnerships with organizations headquartered in countries with differing labor laws and player contract regulations. What is the most prudent initial step to ensure compliance with Alabama Esports Law and mitigate international legal risks? Option A. Rely exclusively on the legal advice provided by the counsel of the foreign players or partner organizations. Option B. Utilize standard international esports contract templates and assume they are sufficient for all agreements involving international players and partners. Option C. Proceed with agreements based on informal understandings and general international business practices, deferring legal review until a dispute arises. Option D. Engage legal counsel with expertise in both Alabama Esports Law and international contract law to review all proposed player contracts, partnership agreements, and operational structures. The correct answer is D. Engage legal counsel with expertise in both Alabama Esports Law and international contract law to review all proposed player contracts, partnership agreements, and operational structures. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires navigating the complexities of international law within the specific regulatory framework of Alabama's esports landscape. The core difficulty lies in balancing the need for international collaboration and player mobility with Alabama's domestic laws and regulations governing esports operations, contracts, and player welfare. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance while fostering growth and fair competition. The best professional approach involves proactively seeking legal counsel specializing in both Alabama esports law and international contract law. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the jurisdictional ambiguities and potential conflicts by engaging experts who can interpret and apply relevant Alabama statutes, regulations, and any applicable international treaties or agreements to the specific situation. This ensures that all contracts and operational agreements are drafted in a manner that is legally sound and enforceable within Alabama, while also respecting the rights and obligations of international participants. It prioritizes compliance and risk mitigation by obtaining authoritative guidance before committing to international partnerships or player recruitment. An incorrect approach would be to assume that standard international contract templates are sufficient without Alabama-specific legal review. This is professionally unacceptable because it ignores the possibility that Alabama law may impose specific requirements or restrictions on esports contracts, player agreements, or even the structure of international esports organizations operating within the state. Failure to consider Alabama's regulatory framework could lead to unenforceable contracts, disputes, and potential penalties under state law. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on the legal advice of the foreign entities counsel. This is professionally unacceptable as foreign legal counsel will primarily be knowledgeable about their own jurisdiction's laws and may not be adequately versed in Alabama's specific esports regulations. This could result in contracts that are valid internationally but violate Alabama statutes, creating significant legal exposure for the Alabama-based esports entity. Finally, an incorrect approach is to proceed without any legal consultation, assuming that the international nature of the agreement negates the need for local legal oversight. This is professionally unacceptable and highly risky. It demonstrates a disregard for the legal obligations and protections afforded by Alabama law to both the esports entity and its players, regardless of their nationality. This oversight can lead to significant legal liabilities, reputational damage, and operational disruptions. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes understanding the specific legal landscape of Alabama esports, identifying potential international legal entanglements, and proactively engaging qualified legal counsel to bridge these two domains. This involves due diligence, risk assessment, and a commitment to operating within the established legal boundaries of the jurisdiction. Question 14. The risk matrix shows a potential for regulatory conflict arising from national legislation impacting esports operations within Alabama. Considering this, what is the most prudent and legally sound strategy for an Alabama-based esports organization to adopt regarding national regulations affecting its business? Option A. Proactively research and consult legal counsel to understand how federal consumer protection, intellectual property, and anti-gambling laws might apply to esports activities and player agreements in Alabama, and implement compliance measures accordingly. Option B. Focus exclusively on Alabama state laws and regulations, assuming that national legislation has minimal direct impact on the esports industry within the state. Option C. operate under the assumption that the nascent nature of esports means it is largely exempt from national regulatory oversight until specific federal laws are enacted for the industry. Option D. Prioritize maximizing immediate revenue streams by entering into agreements and offering services without a thorough review of potential national regulatory implications. Correct answer is A. Proactively research and consult legal counsel to understand how federal consumer protection, intellectual property, and anti-gambling laws might apply to sports activities and player agreements in Alabama, and implement compliance measures accordingly. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires navigating the complex and evolving landscape of national regulations that impact sports, specifically within the context of Alabama. The rapid growth of esports means that existing legal frameworks may not perfectly address all emerging issues, necessitating careful interpretation and application of relevant laws. Professionals must balance the interests of various stakeholders, including players, teams, tournament organizers, and the public, while ensuring compliance with federal statutes and guidelines that may have indirect but significant effects on the esports industry in Alabama. The best approach involves proactively identifying and understanding how federal laws, such as those related to consumer protection, intellectual property, and potentially anti-gambling statutes, might apply to esports operations and player agreements in Alabama. This includes consulting with legal counsel specializing in sports and entertainment law to interpret these national regulations and their specific implications for the state. By adopting this diligent and informed stance, organizations can mitigate risks, ensure fair practices, and build a sustainable and compliant esports ecosystem within Alabama. This proactive engagement with national regulatory frameworks is crucial for ethical operation and long-term success. An approach that focuses solely on state-level regulations without considering national implications is professionally deficient. While Alabama may have specific laws governing certain aspects of esports, neglecting federal statutes could lead to non-compliance and legal challenges. For instance, if a national consumer protection law dictates certain disclosure requirements for in-game purchases or prize pools, an Alabama-centric view might overlook these critical obligations, exposing the organization to penalties. Another inadequate approach is to assume that because esports is a relatively new industry, it is entirely unregulated at the national level. This assumption is dangerous and can lead to significant legal and ethical breaches. Federal agencies may have existing mandates that can be applied to esports, even if not explicitly designed for it. For example, the Federal Trade Commission, FTC, has broad authority over deceptive or unfair business practices, which could extend to misleading advertising or sponsorship disclosures in esports. Ignoring this potential oversight is a significant regulatory failure. Finally, an approach that prioritizes immediate commercial gains over regulatory compliance is ethically unsound and professionally irresponsible. While profitability is a key objective, it cannot come at the expense of adhering to national laws. This could involve overlooking potential issues related to player welfare, data privacy, or intellectual property rights, all of which are often addressed by federal legislation. Such a short-sighted strategy risks severe reputational damage and legal repercussions that could cripple an esports organization. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that begins with a comprehensive risk assessment, identifying all potential national regulatory touchpoints relevant to their esports operations in Alabama. This should be followed by thorough legal research and consultation with experts to understand the nuances of applicable federal laws. Implementing robust compliance programs and regularly reviewing them in light of evolving national regulations and industry practices will foster a culture of integrity and ensure long-term viability. Question 15. Governance review demonstrates that an Alabama-based esports organization has engaged both freelance graphic designers and full-time content creators to develop unique branding elements, promotional videos, and in-game overlays. The organization has paid for these services, but has not consistently utilized formal written contracts that explicitly address intellectual property ownership. What is the most prudent and legally sound approach for the organization to ensure it holds the necessary intellectual property rights for all developed assets? Option A. Rely on the informal verbal agreements and understandings that have been in place, believing that the organization's investment in the creator's work is sufficient evidence of ownership. Option B. Immediately implement standardized, comprehensive written contracts for all current and future engagements, including explicit work-for-hire clauses or clear assignment of intellectual property rights to the organization, and retroactively seek to formalize agreements for past work where feasible. Option C. Assume that payment for services rendered automatically transfers all intellectual property rights to the organization under Alabama law, regardless of the absence of written agreements. Option D. Wait for any potential intellectual property disputes to arise before taking any formal action, and then address ownership on a case-by-case basis through negotiation or litigation. The correct answer is B. Immediately implement standardized, comprehensive written contracts for all current and future engagements, including explicit work-for-hire clauses or clear assignment of intellectual property rights to the organization, and retroactively seek to formalize agreements for past work where feasible. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent complexities of intellectual property, IP, ownership in a rapidly evolving digital and collaborative environment, particularly within the context of Alabama's burgeoning esports industry. The core difficulty lies in clearly delineating ownership rights for creative works developed by independent contractors and employees, ensuring compliance with Alabama law, and preventing potential disputes that could hinder the growth and reputation of the esports organization. Careful judgment is required to balance the organization's need for proprietary assets with the rights of creators. The best approach involves proactively establishing clear ownership through well-defined contractual agreements that explicitly assign all IP rights to the esports organization. This approach is correct because Alabama law, like most jurisdictions, generally upholds contractual agreements regarding IP ownership. By ensuring that independent contractor agreements and employee contracts contain robust work-for-hire clauses or explicit assignment clauses, the organization legally secures ownership of all content created within the scope of their engagement. This aligns with the principle that the entity commissioning or employing the creator should benefit from the fruits of that labor, provided it is clearly stipulated. This proactive measure minimizes ambiguity and provides a strong legal foundation for the organization's IP portfolio. An incorrect approach would be to assume that simply commissioning the work automatically grants the organization ownership without a formal agreement. This is professionally unacceptable because, under Alabama law, without explicit assignment or a valid work-for-hire designation, which has specific statutory requirements, the creator may retain ownership of the IP even if the organization paid for its creation. This can lead to significant legal battles and the inability to freely use or monetize the content. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to rely on informal understandings or verbal agreements regarding IP ownership. This is flawed because such agreements are notoriously difficult to prove and are often unenforceable in court. Alabama law requires clear and demonstrable intent, which is best achieved through written contracts. Relying on informal arrangements creates a high risk of future disputes and legal challenges, undermining the organization's IP security. Finally, an incorrect approach is to adopt a passive stance, waiting for potential IP disputes to arise before addressing ownership. This reactive strategy is professionally unsound because it leaves the organization vulnerable. By the time a dispute emerges, significant damage may have already been done, including reputational harm and financial loss. Proactive IP management is crucial for long-term stability and growth in the competitive esports landscape. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes clear, written agreements from the outset of any creative engagement. This involves consulting with legal counsel specializing in intellectual property and contract law in Alabama to draft comprehensive agreements that cover all potential IP scenarios. Regular review and updating of these agreements to reflect evolving legal standards and business practices are also essential components of sound professional practice. Question 16. Market research demonstrates a growing esports presence in Alabama, prompting the formation of a new professional esports organization. Considering the legal landscape of Alabama, which of the following methods for establishing the esports organization as a legal entity is most advisable to ensure proper governance and liability protection? Option A. Utilize readily available online legal document templates for business formation, assuming a standard corporate structure will suffice for any new business. Option B. Mimic the legal structure of established traditional sports leagues in Alabama as esports is fundamentally a form of competitive sport. Option C. Engage legal counsel specializing in Alabama corporate law and esports to determine the most suitable entity structure, e.g., LLC, S Corp, C Corp, based on the organization's specific operational needs and risk profile. Option D. Establish the organization as a sole proprietorship or general partnership to simplify initial setup and minimize early administrative burdens. Correct answer is C. Engage legal counsel specializing in Alabama corporate law and esports to determine the most suitable entity structure, e.g., LLC, S Corp, C Corp, based on the organization's specific operational needs and risk profile. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of how a nascent industry like esports interacts with established legal frameworks, specifically concerning its formation as a legal entity within Alabama. The core difficulty lies in identifying the most appropriate and legally sound method for establishing an esports organization, balancing operational needs with regulatory compliance. Careful judgment is required to avoid misclassification, which could lead to significant legal and financial repercussions. The best approach involves consulting with legal counsel specializing in corporate law and, ideally, with experience in the entertainment or sports industries in Alabama. This professional guidance ensures that the chosen entity structure, e.g., LLC, S Corp, C Corp, aligns with the organization's goals, liability protection needs, and Alabama's specific business formation statutes. This method is correct because it prioritizes expert legal advice tailored to the unique circumstances of an esports entity operating within Alabama's jurisdiction, thereby minimizing the risk of non-compliance and ensuring a robust legal foundation. This aligns with the general ethical obligation of professionals to seek and act upon competent advice when dealing with complex legal matters. An approach that involves self-registration based on general online templates without legal consultation is professionally unacceptable. This fails to account for the specific nuances of Alabama corporate law and the particular operational characteristics of an esports entity, potentially leading to an inappropriate legal structure that offers inadequate liability protection or creates unforeseen tax liabilities. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to adopt the legal structure of a traditional sports league without considering the distinct operational and revenue models of esports. This overlooks the fact that esports organizations may have different needs regarding intellectual property, digital asset management, and player contracts, which might not be adequately addressed by a structure designed for physical sports. Finally, forming the entity as a sole proprietorship or general partnership without understanding the implications for personal liability is also professionally unsound. This approach exposes the founder's personal assets to business debts and legal claims, a risk that can often be mitigated through proper corporate structuring, which is a fundamental consideration for any new business. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the core business objectives and risk tolerance. This should be followed by thorough research into relevant Alabama business laws and regulations. Crucially, engaging with qualified legal professionals who can provide advice specific to the esports industry in Alabama is paramount. This ensures that the chosen legal entity structure is not only compliant, but also strategically advantageous for the long-term success and protection of the esports organization. Question 17. The assessment process reveals that an Alabama-based esports production company is creating a documentary series analyzing the strategic evolution of professional Dota 2 play over the last decade. The series intends to incorporate extensive clips of professional matches, character ability demonstrations, and in-game audio commentary from various tournaments. The company's legal team is seeking guidance on whether this use of copyrighted game content constitutes fair use under Alabama law, particularly considering the transformative nature of their documentary's analytical and historical purpose. Which of the following approaches best navigates this situation? Option A. Focus solely on the fact that the game content is commercial in nature, arguing that commercial use automatically disqualifies the work from fair use protection, irrespective of any transformative elements or analytical value added by the documentary. Option B. Conduct a detailed four-factor fair use analysis, focusing on the documentary's purpose and character as commentary and historical analysis, the nature of the game content, the amount and substantiality of clips used in relation to the documentary's overall narrative, and the lack of negative market impact on the original game's sales or licensing. Option C. Prioritize the duration of the incorporated game footage, concluding that if the clips exceed a certain arbitrary time limit, the use is infringing, without further consideration of the purpose or transformative nature of the documentary. Option D. Assume that any use of copyrighted game footage and audio in a documentary constitutes copyright infringement unless explicit permission is obtained from the game developer, regardless of the documentary's analytical or historical intent. Correct answer is B. Conduct a detailed four-factor fair use analysis, focusing on the documentary's purpose and character as commentary and historical analysis, the nature of the game content, the amount and substantiality of clips used in relation to the documentary's overall narrative, and the lack of negative market impact on the original game's sales or licensing. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the rights of intellectual property holders with the evolving nature of content creation and consumption in the esports industry within Alabama. The core tension lies in determining when the use of copyrighted material in esports broadcasts and commentary crosses the line from permissible fair use into infringement. Careful judgment is required to navigate the nuances of Alabama's interpretation of copyright law as it applies to transformative works. Best professional approach involves a thorough analysis of the four-factor fair use test as interpreted under Alabama law, specifically considering the transformative nature of the new work. This means evaluating the purpose and character of the use, e.g., for criticism, commentary, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, or research, the nature of the copyrighted work, the amount and substantiality of the portion used in relation to the copyrighted work as a whole, and the effect of the use upon the potential market for or value of the copyrighted work. When a new esports broadcast uses existing game footage, character designs, or audio for purposes like critical analysis of gameplay, historical retrospective of a tournament, or educational content explaining game mechanics, and this use significantly alters the original work's purpose and adds new expression or meaning, it is more likely to be considered transformative and thus fall under fair use. This approach prioritizes adherence to established legal principles while acknowledging the creative and analytical contributions of the new work. An incorrect approach would be to assume that any use of copyrighted game footage in an esports broadcast is automatically infringing simply because it is derived from a commercial product. This fails to recognize the potential for transformative use, which is a key element of fair use. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on the duration of the footage used without considering the qualitative aspect and the overall purpose of the use. While the amount used is a factor, a brief but highly critical or analytical segment could still be fair use, whereas extensive, unedited gameplay footage used purely for entertainment without added commentary or analysis would be less likely to be considered transformative. Furthermore, an approach that ignores the market effect of the new work on the original game's sales or licensing opportunities would be flawed, as this is a critical component of the fair use analysis. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the copyrighted material in question. Next, they must meticulously apply the four factors of fair use, paying particular attention to the degree of transformation and the purpose of the new work. This involves researching relevant Alabama case law and legal interpretations of copyright and fair use. If the use appears to be transformative and meets the other fair use criteria, it is likely permissible. If there is significant doubt, seeking legal counsel specializing in intellectual property and media law in Alabama is the most prudent course of action to mitigate risk. Question 18. Which approach would be most prudent for an Alabama-based esports organization seeking to utilize popular game titles and their associated branding in its promotional materials and tournament broadcasts, considering the regulatory landscape of Alabama? Option A. Proactively identify all intellectual property rights holders for the chosen game titles and secure explicit, written licensing agreements that clearly define the scope of use, territory, and duration before any commercial exploitation. Option B. Assume that the public availability of game titles and their branding on digital platforms implies a tacit license for commercial use by any interested party in Alabama. Option C. Proceed with using game titles and branding based on informal verbal agreements with individuals claiming to represent the rights holders, without formal documentation. Option D. Utilize game titles and branding that are widely used in other esports events, without verifying specific licensing requirements for the Alabama market. The correct answer is A. Proactively identify all intellectual property rights holders for the chosen game titles and secure explicit, written licensing agreements that clearly define the scope of use, territory, and duration before any commercial exploitation. Explanation. The scenario presents a common challenge in the burgeoning esports industry within Alabama, navigating the licensing requirements for intellectual property in a rapidly evolving market. Professionals must balance the desire for rapid market entry and revenue generation with the imperative of strict adherence to Alabama's regulatory framework for licensing agreements, particularly concerning the use of game titles and associated branding. Failure to secure proper licensing can lead to significant legal repercussions, including infringement claims, financial penalties, and reputational damage, all of which can jeopardize the viability of an esports venture. The most professionally sound approach involves a proactive and thorough due diligence process focused on identifying and securing all necessary intellectual property licenses directly from the rights holders or their authorized agents. This method ensures that the esports organization operates within the legal boundaries established by Alabama law, specifically regarding the commercial exploitation of copyrighted game content. By obtaining explicit, written licenses that clearly define the scope of use, territory, duration, and any associated royalties or fees, the organization mitigates the risk of infringement. This aligns with the principles of responsible business conduct and respects the intellectual property rights of game developers and publishers, which are implicitly protected under Alabama's commercial and intellectual property statutes. An approach that relies on implied consent or assumes that public availability of game content equates to a license for commercial use is fundamentally flawed. This overlooks the explicit legal requirements for licensing intellectual property in Alabama. Such an assumption exposes the organization to significant legal risk, as game developers and publishers actively protect their intellectual property. Furthermore, attempting to circumvent the formal licensing process by using unlicensed content, even if readily accessible, constitutes a direct violation of copyright law and potentially Alabama's unfair trade practices statutes. Another problematic approach would be to proceed with a licensing agreement that is vague or incomplete regarding the specific rights granted. While seemingly expedient, such ambiguity creates a fertile ground for future disputes. If the agreement does not clearly delineate the permitted uses of the intellectual property, it can lead to unintentional breaches of contract and copyright infringement. Alabama courts would likely interpret such ambiguities against the party seeking to exploit the intellectual property, placing the esports organization in a precarious legal position. This highlights the critical need for meticulously drafted and comprehensive licensing agreements that leave no room for misinterpretation. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance and risk mitigation. This involves understanding the specific intellectual property laws applicable in Alabama, conducting thorough research into the ownership of the esports titles and associated branding, and engaging legal counsel experienced in intellectual property and entertainment law. Before any commercial activity commences, all necessary licenses must be identified, negotiated, and formally executed. This systematic and legally grounded approach ensures that the esports organization builds its operations on a solid foundation of compliance, safeguarding its long-term success and reputation within the Alabama esports ecosystem. Question 19. Investigation of a new esports game development project in Alabama reveals several innovative gameplay mechanics and a novel server architecture designed to reduce latency. The development studio is considering how to best protect these innovations. Which of the following approaches best balances the studio's need for protection with regulatory compliance? Option A. Proceed with development without any patent consideration, relying on the assumption that the market is too competitive for patent protection to be relevant. Option B. Conduct a thorough patentability search for the novel mechanics and server architecture, and if patentable elements are identified, file provisional patent applications to establish priority dates. Option C. Wait for a potential publisher to identify and address any patent issues during the due diligence phase of a potential acquisition or licensing agreement. Option D. Assume that game mechanics are not patentable and focus solely on copyright protection for the game's code and assets. The correct answer is B. Conduct a thorough patentability search for the novel mechanics and server architecture, and if patentable elements are identified, file provisional patent applications to establish priority dates. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a game development studio in Alabama concerning intellectual property rights, specifically patents, during the creation of a new esports title. The core difficulty lies in navigating the complex landscape of patent law to ensure the studio's innovations are protected while avoiding infringement on existing patents held by others. Failure to do so can lead to costly litigation, injunctions preventing game release, and significant financial penalties, jeopardizing the studio's viability and reputation. Careful judgment is required to balance innovation with legal compliance. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves conducting a thorough patentability search, and if novel and non-obvious elements are identified, filing provisional patent applications for key game mechanics or technologies. This approach is correct because it proactively secures the studio's intellectual property rights. By filing, the studio establishes a priority date for its inventions, which is crucial in patent law. This allows them to develop and market their game with greater confidence, knowing they have taken steps to protect their unique contributions. Furthermore, it provides a defensive shield against potential infringement claims by others and a basis for licensing or future monetization of their patented technology. This aligns with the general principles of intellectual property protection and the economic incentives for innovation within the technology sector, including game development, as recognized by patent law frameworks. Incorrect approach is analysis. Proceeding with development without any patent consideration, assuming that game mechanics are not patentable or that the market is too crowded to matter, is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This approach ignores the established legal framework for patent protection, which explicitly covers processes, machines, manufacturers, and compositions of matter, and can encompass software-related inventions and novel game mechanics if they meet the criteria of being new, useful, and non-obvious. It exposes the studio to a high risk of infringing existing patents, leading to legal repercussions. Relying solely on copyright protection for game mechanics is also an incorrect approach. While copyright protects the expression of an idea, e.g., the code, artwork, music, it does not protect the underlying functional concepts or processes, which are the domain of patent law. Game mechanics such as unique control schemes, scoring systems, or player interaction algorithms are often functional and can be patentable if they meet the statutory requirements. This approach leaves the core innovative elements of the game vulnerable to being copied or patented by competitors. Assuming that any patentable elements will be discovered and addressed by a publisher during the licensing or acquisition phase is a passive and risky strategy. While publishers may conduct due diligence, the primary responsibility for ensuring freedom to operate and protecting intellectual property rests with the developer. Waiting for a publisher to identify potential patent issues places the burden of risk and potential liability on the studio, which could lead to unfavorable deal terms or the complete collapse of a potential partnership if significant patent conflicts are uncovered late in the process. Professional reasoning. Professionals in game development, particularly in Alabama, should adopt a proactive and informed approach to intellectual property. This involves understanding the distinctions between copyright and patent law and their applicability to game development. A robust decision-making process would include consulting with intellectual property attorneys, specializing in technology and entertainment law early in the development cycle. This consultation should focus on identifying potentially patentable innovations, assessing their novelty and non-obviousness, and strategizing on the best course of action, whether that involves seeking patent protection, carefully documenting development to establish prior art, or designing around existing patents. This diligent approach minimizes legal risks and maximizes the potential value of the studio's creative output. Question 20. An esports betting operator licensed in Alabama reports the following figures for the fiscal quarter. Total wagers received from players amounted to $1, 500,000. Total winnings paid out to players were $950,000. Direct operational costs associated with the betting platform, including payment processing fees and server maintenance, totaled $75,000. If the state of Alabama levies a 10% tax on gross gaming revenue, what is the total tax liability for this operator for the quarter? Option A, $150,000. Option B, $375,000. Option C, $750,000. Option D, $550,000. The correct answer is B, $375,000. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a precise understanding of Alabama's regulatory framework for sports betting, specifically concerning the calculation of gross gaming revenue and the subsequent tax liability. Misinterpreting the definitions or failing to apply the correct formula can lead to significant financial penalties and regulatory noncompliance. Careful judgment is required to ensure accurate reporting and remittance of taxes owed to the state. The best professional practice involves accurately calculating the gross gaming revenue by subtracting the direct costs of operating the betting platform from the total wagers received, and then applying the legally mandated tax rate to this net amount. This approach directly adheres to Alabama's established tax laws for gaming activities, ensuring full compliance and accurate financial reporting. The Alabama Code, specifically sections pertaining to gaming and taxation, dictates that gross revenue is the basis for tax calculation. For instance, if a licensed operator has total wagers of $1,000,000 and pays out $700,000 in winnings, with $50,000 in direct operational costs, e.g., platform fees, payment processing, the gross gaming revenue would be calculated as // gross gaming revenue equals / total wagers / winnings paid out / direct operational costs / gross gaming revenue equals $1,000,000 $700 $50 $000 equals $250 $000 If the state tax rate on gross gaming revenue is 10%, the tax owed would be / tax owed equals / gross gaming revenue times tax rate tax owed equals $250 $000 times 0 10 equals $25 $000. This method ensures that only the net profit from betting activities is taxed, aligning with the principle of taxing revenue after necessary expenses. An incorrect approach would be to calculate the tax solely on total wagers received without accounting for winnings paid out or direct operational costs. This would result in an inflated tax liability and misrepresentation of the actual revenue generated. For example, taxing the full $1,000,000 in wagers at 10% would yield a tax of $100,000, which is significantly higher than the legally owed amount and fails to recognize the costs inherent in the operation. This violates the principle of taxing net revenue as defined by Alabama law. Another incorrect approach would be to deduct only the winnings paid out from total wagers and then apply the tax rate, ignoring direct operational costs. Using the previous figures, this would be / text incorrect gross revenue equals $1,000,000 $700 $000 equals $300 $000 text incorrect tax owed equals $300 $000 times 0 10 equals $30 $000. While closer than the first incorrect method, this still overstates the taxable revenue by failing to deduct legitimate operational expenses, thus contravening the specific definitions of gross gaming revenue under Alabama's regulatory framework. A third incorrect approach would be to apply the tax rate to the profit after all expenses, including indirect overheads not directly tied to the betting operation, e.g., marketing, administrative salaries. While this might seem financially prudent for the operator, it deviates from the legally defined gross gaming revenue, which typically has a more specific scope of deductible costs. Alabama law specifies what constitutes direct operational costs for tax calculation purposes, and including broader overheads would be a misinterpretation of the statute. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Thoroughly reviewing the specific Alabama statutes and regulations governing sports betting and taxation. 2. Clearly defining total wagers, winnings paid out, and direct operational costs according to the legal definitions. 3. Applying the correct mathematical formula for calculating gross gaming revenue. 4. Applying the legally mandated tax rate to the calculated gross gaming revenue. 5. Maintaining meticulous records to support all calculations and ensure audit readiness.